This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them at the end of the video. This painting just broke the world record for the most expensive piece of modern art ever sold at auction.
I think this is it. At $205 million. The Klimt, Julian, is yours. Congratulations. That is a record for any work of art ever sold at Sotheby's, and also the highest price for any modern art work of art ever sold at auction as well.
And I have no idea how to feel about it. So maybe you can help me. This is a painting by Gustav Klimt. It's from 1914 to 1916. It's a painting that is a portrait of Elizabeth Lederer, who was the daughter of one of Klimt's wealthiest and most loyal patrons. I have some thoughts. So this painting was recently auctioned off by Sotheby's for $205 million, which came out to $236 million with all of the buyers and sellers fees and stuff. So this painting was sold ultimately for over $250 million, which was the highest that a piece of modern art has ever been sold at auction, and the second highest that a piece of art in general has ever been sold, which is pretty insane, and I don't know how to feel about it. Let's get into a little bit of why this painting might actually be worth that much money, and also whether or not this is all a grand conspiracy and is actually just a giant money laundering scheme or not. I don't know. Let's talk a little bit more about the painting. This painting was painted near the end of Klimt's life, and it is during the period of time right after what's often called like his golden period, which is his most desirable period, but still extremely, extremely desirable. The way that the painting is laid out is extremely unique and interesting for a few reasons, which I'll get into in a second, but long story short, it really seems like Klimt was a huge... How do I say this? He was a weeb. He was obsessed with Japan and China, and we see a lot of that in this painting. So first off, we see the beautiful Elizabeth. She is standing, and she is what can only be described as cocooned in this like translucent wrap dress that's very like, oh, fitting for the era, but also is kind of like oddly bunched. They call it, it's almost like reminiscent of a hobble skirt, but it also kind of weirdly looks, one can only describe it as bug-like, grub-like, perhaps? Strange. Incredibly strange. Here's what's super interesting. So what's draped around her shoulders, that like cape thing almost, that's like that really colorful pattern thing, is actually an imperial robe from the Qing dynasty, which was only worn by royalty and only worn closed in very specific ceremonial circumstances. So it's really interesting that he chose to depict her in this like emperor's robe. It's cool. It definitely has some undertones of the whole like exoticism that was really popular during that time period. And you can actually see in a lot of artworks from like the 1890s up through the 1920s. Case in point, this is another great example of that. Kind of like the mixing of cultures, but in a very like, wow, look at how cool and exotic that culture is. Klimt had a lot of stuff like that. Like he was known to be a huge collector of kimonos and ukiyo-e prints from Japan, screens, and different pieces of art and stuff like that from a lot in Japan, but also China, which we see more in this work. We see that she's surrounded by like members of the court, and the only real explanation that I have for this, because it didn't really seem like the Lederers, the family, had any real connections to any of that, was just that it was a symbol of social status if you could afford to have a bunch of these oriental artifacts or pieces of art. There was a really cool art movement at the time. I think it was called Japonism. I'm butchering all of these pronunciations. I am very much a write it and not speak it kind of person. Anyway, this was super common at the time, and like before for like Vincent van Gogh, all of these different artists were doing this. And I do think in a way problematic to view Asia in this way, and like the commodification, obviously, of Asian culture was not great, but also really interesting because really does feel like he was just a huge weeb. Do wonder if he would have like a bunch of Naruto figurines nowadays, you know? No shame, just that's not the only interesting motifs in this work, though. We know that Klimt, in the later part of his life, was also getting into a lot of these things like biology, cells, and like learning about mechanisms of the human body. And so you can see in this painting, there are some very like unusual shapes that are featured both on the ground and in the cloak, and like on her that are like vaguely reminiscent of cells, which I know some art historians were like, that's interesting that he would include that. But one of the most interesting things I think about this painting is that people are comparing her shape to that of a butterfly which has just come out of its cocoon. Because if you see, like, she's kind of goofy looking. The shape kind of like, it's not as clear as in some of his other works, and she does admittedly, like, look at her, she kind of looks a little, like I said before, she looks a little grubby. The cloak on the side and how it meets and goes down and then is brought through in the carpet really does make it look like wings, which is just such a cool effect. But that doesn't answer the question, why the heck was it worth $250 million? There's a couple reasons why. The first of which being that this painting is rare. Klimts don't come up super often, especially these like full frontal portraits that he does, especially of women, are very valuable and pretty rare. So it was something that was extremely desirable. The only reason it came up for auction is because the heir to the estate of Estee Lauder died, and he was a huge art collector, had literally thousands of pieces, also donated pieces to art museums, especially like the Whitney Museum, I think. Interesting guy. Seems fairly wholesome as far as billionaires go. So this was for sure a rare occasion, but it's still way surpassed its estimate, which was around like 150 million. Klimt's work is beautiful. If you've seen the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer or The Kiss, it's gorgeous. But it feels like a lot to pay for any work of art. A lot of people might say that it feels like a kick in the face to so many people who are struggling economically, because that's kind of the world that we live in right now. I'm having trouble parsing out whether I feel like this was a super legitimate purchase or whether I feel like there was something shady going on behind the scenes. I want to lean towards it being like a good, legit purchase, but when you're talking about $250 million, it's kind of hard to think that anything ethical is behind that. Here's the thing about art markets in general that's been interesting to observe. The art market, because it is exceptionally small and exclusive and really expensive, has been rife with sketchiness, especially in the ways of tax write-offs, which happen when someone, for instance, pays $3 million for a painting. Over the next 10 years, it becomes worth, let's say, $50 million, but then they donate it to a museum, and then they get to have a tax write-off of all of that money, which means that effectively they just made like $47 million and they didn't have to include it on their taxes at all, which is something that I don't love, but I do love that it encourages the ultra-rich to donate some of these priceless pieces to museums and stuff. The other thing that I am a little bit sketched out by is that a lot of the modern art buying scene is known to be used for money laundering, especially by cartels and people that have a lot of money that they've made in super sketchy ways. And how that works is, say you have, you sell people a bunch of and you have, again, $3 million. You purchase an artwork for that $3 million that you have in essentially like dirty money in that cash. And then through a process of buying and selling the artwork, you like clean that money. Because when people look into the records, they can be like, oh, how did you make all of this money? Oh, you made it from like selling the art that you had. instead of from mystery means. Some would say that one of the sketchiest is actually the most expensive artwork that has ever been sold in auction, which was Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, which was purchased for about $500 million by our main man, everyone's favorite guy, the person who just visited the USA, Mohammed bin Salman, known to be not at all sketchy or underhanded in any of his practices. But here's what else is super interesting and kind of has me conflicted again about this. It really is genuinely an incredible piece of art. If anything is worth that much, I'm happy that it's that one. You don't have to agree with me, but I think it's genuinely really cool. But it's interesting that, as the art market has been, decreasing in value, we've had a couple of these, crazy sales. And this is one of those crazy sales where I'm does this show that people are starting to really care about art again? Which is what I really want it to be. Or does it just show that the economic disparities are growing greater and greater? Or is it both? I don't know. Or is this a glorified NFT? And I don't know. So I want to know what you think. Is this painting worth $250 million? Is any painting worth $250 million? What is the price that we put on preserving these incredible pieces of art? How do we justify that with the fact that so many sketchy things are going on behind the scenes? I honestly don't know. And so I feel conflicted. But I guess one of the happy things to come out of this is that more people are becoming interested in the art world because of how insane and crazy this was. There's good and bad things about that, but I am happy that people are looking at this artwork and trying to analyze it and be like, wow, why do people care about this? Instead of just being like, it's just another dumb NFT. I'm hoping that that's not what they're using it for. But if they are using it for that, hopefully eventually it gets donated to a museum or some public place where people can actually see it and enjoy it, because right now it's just been bought by some random anonymous private collector where we have no idea where it's going or where it will be for the next 20 years. And I hope that wherever it is not inside of a locker where it will eventually be sold off for money laundering purposes. With any luck, maybe eventually we'll be able to see it in a museum. And now a word from our sponsor, accompanied by my cat. I may have felt a little bit conflicted throughout this video, but do you know what I'm not conflicted about is a well-designed website. And that's why I'm super happy that this video is sponsored by Squarespace. Do you want to make a website that looks like a masterpiece, but you don't really have hours and hours to learn all of the tricky formatting, design, and spacing that is required to make a website actually look good? Well, with tons of professionally and beautifully designed templates to choose from, Squarespace makes getting started super easy so that you can focus on the fun parts of building a website, like personalizing it to you. And they have tons of different visual design features that you can fully customize to whatever website you want to do. So you can avoid that classic, is this just a bad template or is this website literally from 2010 look. Plus, if you're using Squarespace to build an online store, they have a bunch of features to really help your business stand out. You can customize your listings with pictures, videos, reviews, related products, and you can even print out shipping labels directly through Squarespace so that you can save a bunch of time while shipping out your products. Overall, I really have enjoyed using Squarespace, and they have been an absolute blast. So if you'd like to try it out, head to squarespace.com/abrushwithbecca for a free trial, and use code abrushwithbecca to save 10% off of any website or domain. Happy website making, everyone, and thank you for watching. Listen, ultimately, I don't know how to feel, and I feel conflicted, and I really love that people are getting invested in this, but I feel frustrated that it's accompanied with such a massive economic crisis. And I know a lot of people are kind of in this situation that me and a lot of my acquaintances are in, regardless of how much money you're making. I'm not sure I'm ever going to be able to afford things like a house. I want to be happy about something that's such an interesting and cool world record, but it carries such a crazy weight behind it too. Anyway, this has been Ramble Times with Becca. Hope you have a great day. Thank you to my patrons, and I guess we'll see how much more expensive art gets in the future. That'll be interesting. There's been a lot of deep existential staring in this video, I feel like. Okay, bye!